So good evening, everybody. I invite you to sit down. I'm so glad that the weather was bad yesterday so that we wouldn't need to reschedule this for tonight. So this is the fourth of four lectures that we are having in collaboration with the Jewish Theological Seminary. Dr. Schwartz will speak about JTS and some of the opportunities to learn at JTS. But as I've done with the other three people speaking, I want to take an opportunity to introduce Dr. Schwartz, not by reading a bio of all of her many accomplishments, and she's had many, but to speak a bit personally. So I met Dr. Schwartz when I was a freshman at Barnard. I was only at the Barnard undergraduate program, but I met this guy named David Levy, who was in the joint program between JTS and Columbia University. And I met him because my friend Erica was a freshman at Barnard and JTS and lived at JTS. And she said, "Rachel, come to my dorm. You'll probably meet some guys on Simchat Torah." I meet Dave. Dave had a girlfriend. That's a story for another time. But all of a sudden, I start learning about the joint program, and I understand there's this incredible program where you can get 2 degrees, not just one, where you get over 160 credits, not just 120, over the course of the years together. So I meet with Dr. Schwartz, and I say, "I'd like to maybe take a class." And she says, "Okay." So I enroll as a non-matriculated student at the beginning of my second semester freshman year of college. By that summer, I decided to apply and go to the double degree program with Barnard and JTS. And as they say, the rest is history. I became the List College president. We worked very closely to each other. And I would say the most special and most important part of our life is that Dr. Schwartz, Shuly, and her late husband, Gershon, were part of our wedding. Gershon married us, and Shuly led the tish at our wedding, and their son, Moshe, was a groomsman in our wedding. So the relationship that I have to Shuly, to Dr. Schwartz, has gone on now for over 20 years and is one that I really, really value. She's been a mentor and a teacher and a leader. She's the dean of both the undergraduate and the graduate schools at JTS. She's inspired generations of people to learn and to study and to understand the beauty of history. And so when I was able to reach out to her and say, "Will you be the speaker for this program where we focus on American Jewish history?" I was so glad she said yes, and that all could be worked out. So I'm glad and honored to welcome her tonight. Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Rachel, Rabbi. It is a pleasure for me to be here tonight. And I can just compliment you on your great judgment in having such a terrific rabbi, and take just the credit in that all I did was notice how talented she was when she was 18. And really, thank you for your kind words, but your achievements are your own. And it's wonderful to see you flourish, and so glad that all of you have the opportunity to benefit from her rabbinic leadership. So since this is the fourth and final session, I just want to take an opportunity for a little bit of a commercial for JTS. You heard a little bit about the undergraduate program. It's a well-kept secret within JTS that we have this program. It really doesn't exist anywhere else. It's something you ought to know about for your children, grandchildren, really any young person that you know who really wants something a little extra during his or her college years, to not only get a terrific liberal arts education, but also to get a first-rate Jewish studies education, and be in a community of other young people who are trying to figure out what kind of Jews they want to be as adults while they're gaining this first-class education. But I also want you to know that if you've enjoyed this series, then JTS has opportunities for adults. This population in the Kext Graduate School refer to themselves as mature learners. There is an opportunity for you to come as a non-degree student and take a class at JTS with any one of us who've taught you, or any one of our other fantastic faculty members. So if your appetite was whetted for what serious Jewish learning could be, and there are others like you who've taken advantage of adult education in synagogues, who've done year-long courses like Maya or gone to Skirball or whatever it is, and want something more, want something a bit more rigorous, where you're actually taking classes, preparing, doing reading, writing papers, and usually individuals at this stage of life will say, well, I don't know, I haven't written a paper in 40 years. I'm not sure I want to do that. And we will help you choose a class suited to your interests. And most students, after one course, say, oh yeah, I guess I can do this, and I love it, and I want to do more. And many of them actually do matriculate for a degree, not because they need that degree, but because it provides great fulfillment and enrichment for many, many individuals. So I brought lots of brochures, and Rabbi Ain will put them out in the hallway, so you'll have the opportunity to take them, and feel free to be in touch. I'd be delighted to help you take that next step in your Jewish learning journey. Okay, so I understand that this is the final session, and I suppose that each of my colleagues tried to convince you that their era of Jewish history was the most fascinating. And I don't blame them, because that's what we scholars do. We immerse ourselves in a period of history, and we are sure that ours is the most important. But I know that mine really is, because I have a bit of an advantage. You see, with American Jewish history, in addition to its being endlessly fascinating, the people we study are those people who are literally closest to us. They are our ancestors, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And so their struggles resonate most deeply with our own. So before we begin, because my assignment is to give the full span of American Jewish history in 1 hour, let's think for a moment about the overarching questions that are going to frame our learning tonight. You've studied the earlier periods of Jewish history, so my first question for you to think about is American Jewish history simply the next chapter in Jewish history, and as such a continuation of the modern period that you studied with my colleague Professor Fishman, or is the American Jewish experience sui generis? Is it so exceptional, so radically different from anything Jews experienced before that it is indeed unique in the annals of Jewish history? And of course, in good Talmudic fashion, I will already tell you that the answer is both. In some ways, the experience is unprecedented, and in others, it builds on the century-old experience of the Jewish people. So tonight, we'll examine what did it mean to be an American Jew? How has our status as Americans evolved, and how have we cultivated our Jewishness in America? And it's these kinds of questions that led me to study American Jewish history some 40 years ago. Of course, since I was studying at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is known above all for its rabbinical school, and where the emphasis is on classical Jewish texts, professors were constantly trying to get me to study rabbinics. One in particular, Professor Max Kadushin, was a neighbor of mine, and each time we would cross paths going back and forth to our apartment, he'd corner me and he'd say, "Look, you're a smart woman. Why waste your time studying American Jewish history? My father was a peddler, your grandfather was a peddler. That's a whole story. Now come study rabbinics." But that's precisely what drew me to the field, the combination of scholarship and personal history, the ability to learn more about myself, even as I studied the past, to bring Jewish history to life for others by focusing on ordinary people and their stories, the lives of our grandparents, examining the real struggles that they had in trying to figure out how to be good Jews and loyal Americans and how to combine the two. These are the same issues that we still struggle with today. So in 1 hour, we can only touch on highlights, and that's what I'm going to try to do. So first of all, we have to start at the beginning to look at those original 23 Jews who settled in the New World, in New Amsterdam, which, as we know, is the southern tip of New York City. So who were these 23? We know that they were Sephardic emigres. You'll recall, probably from Professor Gampel, that the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. They wandered Ottoman Empire, etc. Since we know that 1492 is when the New World was discovered, it's not surprising that some of those Jews found their way to the New World. In particular, they were fleeing the Inquisition, which I'm sure you also studied. So a few of them tried to press their luck by going to the Dutch colony of Brazil, which was great until 1654. There were about 1,500 Jews there by then. In 1654, Portugal recaptures. I see you're shaking your head. Great. Portugal recaptures Brazil. That means they're going to introduce the Inquisition. Some of these Jews go back to Europe, and a couple of brave souls get on a boat. They're not really sure where they're going, but they end up in New Amsterdam, penniless, in need of refuge, and they want to settle. The governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to expel them. Guess a little reminiscent of our immigration debate today, actually. He was worried that, of course, they'd be a burden, and he wrote to the Dutch West India Company requesting that this, quote, repugnant and deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, not be allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony. Thankfully, the Dutch West India Company interceded and reminded him why it would be a good idea to allow the Jews to stay. I'll cut to the bottom line here, cut to the chase. They had a lot of good arguments, but the bottom line is that Jews are the principal shareholders of the Dutch West India Company. So if you want support, you better let the Jews stay. And not surprisingly, it worked. So the company wrote to Stuyvesant and said, we've resolved that these people may travel and trade to and in New Netherlands and live and remain there, provided that the poor shall not become a burden. You will now govern yourself accordingly. But remember the time element, and that's really important here. You know, no email. You write a letter, it goes on a boat, it takes a few months to get there, then the company meets, it thinks about it, it comes up with a letter, they draft a letter, they review it, they send it out, they put it on a boat, it comes back. By the time it comes back, the letter's dispatched in September. The response comes in April. So Jews have already been living here and built relationships and figured out how to make a living. So the social history is equally as important. They're already beginning to integrate into this country. Acceptance is one thing, true integration is another. That takes time, right? They could live, but where they could trade was restricted. They were not allowed to build a synagogue initially. It took two requests before it was granted to allow them to build a cemetery. Luckily, for American Jewish history, the colonial period was long. They arrived in 1654. It allowed a long period of time before the United States of America was established for there to be many precedents which gave religious and social opportunities for integration. So by the time of the revolution, Jews felt secure enough in this country that they took sides. They weren't afraid to express their opinion. And you had Jews, both Jews who were supporters of Britain and Jews who supported the revolution. And they weren't afraid to do that. So what happens after the revolution? Americans were trying to establish a democratic form of government. And as we know, they ratified the Constitution of the United States, and the two portions of the Constitution that are directly relevant for Jews was Article 6, Clause 3, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under the United States. And the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You studied, you heard, and delved into the emancipation process in Europe. Here in the United States, for the very first time, Jews were offered emancipation as part and parcel of the establishment of this country. The Constitution of the United States does not mention Jews anywhere. In fact, when these two sections were developed, they weren't even thinking of Jews. This is a hugely significant development for American Jewry. There is no prehistory of Jews being denied equality, as there was in every country of Europe. Here, Jews become citizens when every American living in this country, with the qualifications of being, landowner. There were other issues, obviously, but their religion did not hold them back. And the confidence that Jews had is expressed by this story that I love. In 1788, when the Constitution was ratified, they had parades all around the country. And of course, the biggest parade was in Philadelphia, because that was the capital of the United States at the time. And Jews took part in the parade. On July 4th in Philadelphia in 1788, the parade was lavish, and it included floats that would go by, dramatizing themes such as independence, the Union, the federal roof. Blacksmiths walked behind large bellows representing the passion to keep the flame of liberty alive. Ministers marched arm in arm, and though there were no rabbis in this country yet, chazanim filled that role. Other occupations that marched together include shoemakers, hairdressers, and school children. One of these children, Naphtali Phillips, later described the events in a letter, making special mention of the food served at the end of the parade. Because what's a celebration without food? Okay, so listen to his words. There were a number of long tables loaded with all kinds of provisions, with a separate table for the Jews, who for religious reasons could not partake of the meat from the other tables. But they had a full supply of pickled salmon, bread and crackers, almonds, raisins, etc. This table was under the charge of an old cobbler named Isaac Moses. Picture this in your mind. This is astounding. In 1788, Jews felt perfectly comfortable standing simultaneously as part of the masses of Americans marching, and then apart from them, eating from their own table. This embodies the central accomplishment of the revolutionary period, where Jews gained full equality and also felt completely comfortable striving for acceptance and integration as Jews. So how did this actually play out? During this period, Jews were numbered about 2,500 individuals. It's not a lot. It's less than 0.1% of the population. And they had the challenge of maintaining American Jewish families. Intermarriage was part and parcel of the fabric of the Jewish community. Over 25% of Jews intermarried. Frankly, because there just were not enough Jews to go around. Families that cared deeply about in-marriage spent much time, energy, and resources trying to do everything in their power to make sure that their daughters married Jewish men. They networked with Jews in the cities where Jews lived in this country, but nevertheless, intermarriage routinely occurred. It was heart-wrenching for many families. One of the most prominent families was the Franks family, and listen to Abigail Franks in her a letter to her son when her daughter, Phila, eloped to marry the Gentile, Oliver Delancey, in 1743. My spirits were for some time so depressed that it was a pain for me to speak or see anyone. I have overcome it so far as to not make my concern so conspicuous, but I shall never have that serenity or peace within I have so happily had hitherto. But many intermarried Jews continued to engage with the Jewish community. Think about it. Most communities needed the support of every willing Jew, intermarried or not. So the leadership could not afford to take any principled stands that would alienate people. At the same time, some Jews took more aggressive measures to ensure a more robust Jewish life for their families. I'm going to read to you from a Yiddish letter that Rebecca Samuel wrote to her parents. She was living in Petersburg, Virginia, writing back to her parents in Hamburg. She said, "Dear parents, I know quite well you would not want me to bring up my children like Gentiles. Here they cannot become anything else. Jewishness is pushed aside here. Here in Petersburg, there are 10 or 12 Jews, and they're not worthy of being called Jews." We can be so mean to each other, so judgmental. "We have a shochet who goes to the market and buys treif meat and brings it home. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the people worshipped without one Sefer Torah, and not one of them wore a talit, except Hyman and my Sammy's godfather. The latter's an old man of 60. He's been in America 30 years already. He doesn't want to remain here any longer and will go with us to Charleston. In that place, there's a blessed community of 300 Jews." So she's writing to tell her parents, "Don't worry, I'm getting out of here. I can't stay in Petersburg because it's not a robust enough Jewish community for me." And she adds, "You can believe me that I crave to see a synagogue to which I can go." Also interesting in 1792. She doesn't say, "I need a synagogue for my husband to go to." She wants one for herself. We do not know what the Sabbath and the holidays are. All the Jewish shops stay open on the Sabbath. But ours, we do not allow to open. With us, there's still some Sabbath. You must believe me that in our house, we all live as Jews as much as we can. She reassures her mother that, as for the Gentiles, we have nothing to complain about. For the sake of a livelihood, we do not have to leave, nor do we have to leave because of debts. You cannot know what a wonderful country this is for the common man. One can live here peacefully. So what are we learning so far? She already knows what the essential ingredients are of Jewish communal life. You need a critical mass of Jews. You need Jewish stuff. You need a Sefer Torah, right, is the most important symbol of that. You need Jews who care about doing Jewish things together. You need role models for children, adults that they can trust and rely on and that are honest, that care about Judaism. And you need an open, free environment without anti-Semitism to be able to live as Jews. All things that we still struggle with today. In the 19th century, American Jews, the population grows. There's a migration of Jews from Central Europe, the Germanic lands, and by around 1880, there are about 250,000 Jews here. It's this immigration that settles the heartland, upstate areas of New York, Pennsylvania, the Midwest, Ohio, Chicago, Detroit, etc. So all of that, and some eventually make their way all across the plains and to what will become California. In many ways, it's this group that sets up a lot of the institutions that still govern Jewish life today. But again, they want to make it in America, but they also want to remain Jewish. But it's kind of hard to do that. They're on the road all week peddling, because peddling is the one thing you can do if you don't really know the language. You just put some stuff on your back or in a wagon. You show it as you get to each farm. You use a little sign language to agree on a price, and you can figure it out. You can make a living, and that's what they did. But what was the most important initial Jewish institution? It was the boarding house, because you were on the road all week, and then Friday night you wanted to hang out with other Jews, and you'd find a Jewish boarding house. And there Jews would have Shabbat dinner and play poker, because they wanted to relax with other Jews. And what would happen? Jews got a little more proficient in English. They learned a heck of a lot about American culture from all of the Gentile farms that they visited, and eventually they amassed enough money, decided maybe now I can get married, ended up opening a little general store where they could then sell goods to the next group of peddlers that arrived. And that's how a lot of these towns were established throughout the country. And, so how did Jewish life get going? Well, either first somebody died, and they're like, oh, we need a Jewish cemetery, right? Or probably even before that, they're on the road, they're hanging out at the boarding house, and someone says, I don't know, I think Rosh Hashanah is probably around this time of year. Anybody know when it is? I think we should do something. Anyone know how to pray? And this becomes the beginnings of Jewish life, of what will eventually become synagogues, benevolent associations to take care of individuals who could no longer make a living, cemeteries, and then once there are children, some Jewish education. We have Rebecca Gratz to thank for that. She developed a Sunday school model, because before this is before universal public school education in this country, and a lot of the education, Sunday school education, is Christian, and some of the teaching is done with a missionizing intent. Well, Jews didn't want their children going to these schools, so they had to provide schools of their own. Americans also loved joining clubs by the mid-19th century. So 1843, you have the establishment of B'nai B'rith, which was going to be the Jewish equivalent of these kinds of clubs. And you begin to have Jewish newspapers in the 19th century. There are 3 Jewish newspapers, and this, we're so much in the mindset of the 21st century that we have to think back to what it was like before you could just go on Facebook and connect with people all over the place. So I will help you conjure up that image by reading you this letter, which kind of like breaks my heart every time I read it. The man named Isaac Jelinek, he's writing from Texas, and he writes to the editor of the Occident, Isaac Leeser. He wrote in 1853, "It will surprise you, sir, to hear from such a remote part of the frontier of Texas. I'm sorry to say that I'm a poor scholar. I cannot express my feeling with the pen when I accidentally came in possession of such invaluable information as contained in your newspaper. May the living God spare you that you may accomplish what you've undertaken to do. I'm sorry I was ignorant what was going on, although I'm in this country 15 years. I'm happy, very happy indeed, to see that our true religion has a public advocate. I cannot find words to express my feelings. Put me on your list of subscribers. I would like to send you the pay in advance, but here we cannot obtain paper money when we please, and I live a long ways from the coast. As soon as I obtain paper money, I will remit it to you. I hope you will believe me to be a true Jew and a friend to our cause." Thinking of this lone Jew in Texas, so thrilled to find out what's going on with Jews all around the country, we get a small taste of what ordinary Jews felt at the time and of how important it was for them to establish connection to other Jews. Remember, there were so few Jews in this country. They could have so easily disappeared into American life, assimilated. They didn't have any of the strictures that Jews had in Europe that kept them together. But they didn't. They didn't want to. Yes, they wanted to be Americans, but they wanted in their own way to retain their Jewishness. One of the ways they did that religiously evolves into Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism develops from the bottom up, as I just described to you. It also develops from the top down. Once rabbis come, they are worried that this Christian country is so dominant in its culture that Jews are going to have a very hard time maintaining their distinctiveness. So it tries to sort of codify a kind of Judaism that will be more conducive to the thriving of Judaism in America. And so they do that and basically develop principles of a more liberal Judaism, not bound by Jewish law, that recognizes that that kind of religion doesn't speak to the lives of the Jews that were struggling to find their place in this country. And by the end of the 19th century, most Jews in this country were Reform Jews. 90% of the congregations were Reform. And they really felt that they were developing not Reform Judaism, but American Judaism. And it seemed that that might actually be true. But then you had 2.5 million Eastern European immigrants coming to this country, and Reform Judaism was not going to work for them. Because it was much too influenced by 19th century German reform aesthetic. and socioeconomically it wasn't going to work either. Those Jews settle in densely populated urban areas. They bring a rich Yiddish culture and strong Jewish communal ties. And they try to recreate that here as much as they can. Within a generation, many of their sons went off to war. 500,000 Jews served in the armed forces. 11,000 died in combat. 24,000 were wounded. 36,000 were decorated. Having played an integral part in the war, these American Jews came to believe that they no longer had to see themselves as an exotic minority, but rather an integral part of America. And they tried to fashion their lives accordingly. There are two pivotal events that I'd like to refresh your memories about that I think encouraged them to believe that they would succeed. First of all, September 2nd, 1945. Anybody remember that date? Remember what happened on that date? No. Now, I'm thinking cultural history. Here you go. On September 2nd, 1945, Bess Meyerson was crowned Miss America. Jews were bursting with pride. She didn't change her name. She came from a Yiddish speaking family. Her parents were part of the immigrant working class, the left-wing secular Jewish culture of New York City. She was one of us. She symbolized the yearnings and aspirations of a generation of Eastern European Jewish young women for glamour, for fame, for fortune, for arrival and integration into American life. Okay, later that month, September 30th, 1945, another important cultural moment. Detroit Tiger Hank Greenberg hit a ninth-inning grand slam against the St. Louis Browns to win the American League pennant. Baseball, the national pastime, has always been part of the acculturation process for Jews. He was the first important ball player drafted into the war. He then became the first major league veteran to return to the major leagues. From 1933 to 47, he had been the most prominent American Jewish athlete. He was the first Jew elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And remember, he hit this Grand Slam home run. He played in Detroit in the backyard of Henry Ford, who had fueled anti-Semitism in America by publishing the Dearborn Independent, right? Which brought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to an American audience. It was like he was spitting in his face in his own backyard. These two events surpassed the wildest dreams of American Jews in the post-war period. And in many ways, in the ensuing decades, Jews did become quintessential Americans. As one scholar quipped, and I've updated it just a little bit, Jews taught Americans how to dance, Arthur Murray, how to behave, Ann Landers and Dear Abby, how to dress, Ralph Lauren, how to think, Irving Kristol, Alfred Kazin, Norman Podhoretz, how to read, Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, how to laugh, Milton Berle, the Marx Brothers, Joan Rivers, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld. How and what to sing, Irving Berlin, Barry Manilow, Bob Dylan, Stephen Sondheim. And the height of the entrance of Jews into American culture occurred on the live stage with the 1964 debut of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway, which won numerous awards, was the longest-running Broadway show until Grease, and really impacted the culture. But as in every era, Jews not only wanted to immerse themselves in America, to really embody America, but also to maintain their distinctiveness. And they worked to do that in their local communities. This was the heyday of conservative Judaism, the movement that best appealed to the children of Eastern European immigrants who moved out of the city and into suburbia. They were concerned with Jewish survival, but as I said earlier, reform didn't work for them aesthetically or socially, and they associated orthodoxy with the old world. They wanted an ethnic cultural Judaism that was not ideologically oriented, and one that felt traditional, but with a bit more decorum and mixed seating. Synagogues became full-service operations, a place for Jews to meet for social, educational, philanthropic, and religious purposes, a place that provided community but didn't demand too much, and something that wasn't too radical a change from what they were used to. Mordecai Kaplan influenced this development more than any other religious leader, and I think embodied the essence of an American Judaism. He felt it was important to intensify Jewish education, to cultivate the Jewish arts, music, dance. He thought it was important to re-Judaize the home, to work for the rebuilding of the land of Israel, to enrich the content of Jewish worship, and to raise the ethical standards of the Jewish community. But at the same time, in the post-war period, you see groups of newly arrived Jews that are going to dramatically change the landscape of Jewish life in this country over the next 50 years. The Lubavitcher Rebbe comes to the United States in 1940, along with other traditional Jews. Many arrived as refugees after the war as survivors, and they strove to recreate as much as possible the traditional Jewish world that were lost to Hitler. In the decades that followed, Orthodox survivors were hired to teach in Jewish day schools, ultra-Orthodox enclaves grew, kollels were established in Lakewood, Baltimore, Skokie, and elsewhere, and Lubavitch emissaries began to spread out on college campuses and Jewish communities all around the country. Glatt kosher restaurants, Chalav Yisrael pizza, yeshivot, mikvaot, art school publications, and more became more and more common. And for the first time, Orthodox Judaism began to imagine that it might flourish in the New World. And gradually, these traditional expressions of Judaism began to impact the larger Jewish community as well. On the one hand, all American Jews felt more comfortable after the 1960s expressing their distinctive identity. Wearing kippot in public is the most obvious symbol of that. And they welcomed the opportunity to access the traditional Judaism that they imagined was more authentic. On the other hand, the presence of a growing ultra-Orthodox community made mainstream Jews uncomfortable because they worried that this overt Jewishness might compromise their hard-won acculturation. As Orthodoxy moved farther to the right, at the same time, other denominations embraced feminism and other values in modern American life. By the mid-'80s, a woman could be ordained a rabbi in all but the Orthodox movements. Feminism had a profound impact, not only on American Jewish women, but also on Judaism as a whole, because the ways in which Judaism and Jewish leaders had to rethink Judaism for modernity and adjust their thinking about what would work for the Judaism of our day, also enabled American Jews to begin to reassess other aspects of Jewish life. Once you start saying, well, you know, the God language in the liturgy is so male. We have to change the way the liturgy is sung and certainly the way it's translated. Well, then you think, well, you know, there's a lot of other parts of the liturgy that maybe need some refreshing as well. Same thing with biblical interpretation. Once you begin to look at it through the lens of gender, there are lots of other lenses you can bring to bear on our traditional texts. Same thing with rituals. Once you say we need a simchat bat for our daughters, not just Brit Milah ceremony for our sons, you think, well, maybe there are other new ceremonies that we need to have in our lives. Maybe we need a healing service for the sick. So you see the ramifications go beyond the impact on women. And once that happens, it also feeds the hunger of all Jews who are trying to find contemporary meaning in their Judaism. So, where does this story leave us today? The 2013 Pew study gives us some hints. It asked Jews how they consider themselves to be Jewish. We remember, this is very recent history, so we remember this well. We remember the shocking statistic that 22% of Jews describe themselves as being Jews of no religion, or as the shorthand in the survey said, the nones, N-O-N-E-S. If you read the fine print, you find out that that's about the same percentage as Americans in general who feel they are Americans of no religion. At the same time, American Jews of all ages and all kinds of attitudes about religion, in other words, 94% are proud to be Jewish. But what does that mean? When the Pew study asked them, what does being Jewish mean to you today? The top two answers, remembering the Holocaust and leading an ethical life. Number 3, working for justice and equality. About 40%, 43, 42% thought it was important to care about Israel and have a good sense of humor. Not sure what that correlation is. Observing Jewish law was important to only 19% of Jews. So we see that the way in which Jews think about their Jewishness is wide and varied and encompasses many aspects of Jewish life other than religion. You see that in a lot of other things, the decline in affiliation with synagogues by age, in other words, younger as opposed to older. The disdain for labels of saying what kind of Jew you are among younger Jews, and a deep decline in support of Israel among younger Jews. So a lot of the hallmarks of Jewish identity of an earlier era are shifting. Add to that what we've experienced just in the past 2 years. We live in troubled times. I started by quoting to you from Peter Stuyvesant. The last election cycle unleashed anti-Semitic rhetoric that we have not heard in this country for a very long time. We all heard and saw last summer's chants in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. And you may have seen the just released ADL annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which found a 57% increase in 2017, the largest single-year increase on record, and the highest number reported since the ADL started tracking such data in 1979. A lot of these incidents were in schools and college campuses. So sadly, virulent anti-Semitic tropes have found their way into common discourse in 2018. And as we know, it's not easy to put the genie back in the bottle. At the same time, the last election cycle also saw that both candidates for President of the United States had a Jewish son-in-law. Bernie Sanders became the first Jewish candidate to win a presidential primary election, and his Jewishness was barely mentioned in the general community. And we live in an era where the White House Hanukkah party and Pesach Seder have become annual traditions, even though until Jared and Ivanka, no Jew ever lived in the White House. So the contradictions, the blessings, and the challenges of the American Jewish experience continue. I end with the prayer that we all take an active role to ensure that this journey continue to evolve in as robust and meaningful a way as possible. Thank you. I welcome them.
A question, and then you'll answer, or a few questions.
I think a few questions, so we'll get to as many individuals to speak as possible.
Thank you. You began by talking about a beautiful period when Jews first came to this country, and after the revolution, how Jews were so accepted and felt so much a part of American society, American culture, et cetera, et cetera. And then mentioned at the end, you talk about the election and so on. But as you were talking, and I know you were talking in terms of cultural things that were happening, Bess Meyerson, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Where is that strand of anti-Semitism that was there, that I myself experienced, and I'm not talking about 2017. It was there. It was nothing like it is today, much more subverted, much more, I can't use the word innocuous, but not quite in your face is what I'm trying to say. Can you take us down that path a little bit? Because it just didn't start now. Thank you.
Sure.
I enjoyed the talk very much.
Thank you.
The question really is, how does Israel in the future intersect with the American Jewish community?
How does
How does Israel connect? Because the disengagement of American Jews from Israel plays a large role in this whole process, I think. And even Arnie's talked about it here one night, where he talked about the need for some connection between American Jewry and Israel in a very constructive way, and I'm not sure that's possible.
Thanks, and I agree. It was a very comprehensive overview. Can you go back to the 19th century and spend a little time discussing how the North-South divide and slavery affected the Jewish community, and how what the Jewish impact was on the discourse of the discussions around those issues?
Let's just start with those. Those are 3 lectures in and of themselves.
Indeed, indeed. Okay. So anti-Semitism in previous eras, you're absolutely right. It never disappears. I think part of my genie in the bottle imagery is that it's always there. It's never gone. It just kind of bubbles up in certain eras and becomes more dormant or behind closed doors or whatever the image we want in different eras. So in quick overview, there is still lingering anti-Jewish discrimination even after the ratification of the Constitution. For example, I think it was not till 1824 that the Maryland Constitution took out the, under Christ, so you couldn't hold office in Maryland without taking an oath under Christ, so things like that. So we'll segue into, we'll talk about the period of time during the Civil War. So I'll answer your question and then go back to the anti-Semitism trajectory, right? You have Jews just as you had Jews on both sides of the Revolutionary War, you have Jews on both sides in the Civil War, you have rabbis arguing both in favor of slavery. Morris Rafal, rabbi in New York, B'nai Jeshurun, because the Bible obviously condones slavery, so therefore, if we're base ourselves on the Bible, we should be okay with slavery. Many rabbis were opposed. You had a David Einhorn, who was a rabbi in Baltimore, who was an abolitionist, and Baltimore, we don't think about it this way, but Baltimore's a southern town, and he had to flee to Philadelphia for the duration of the war because his views were pretty unpopular. You had Jews who were slave owners, and you had Jews who were very much abolitionists. And here, I would add that I think women played a really important role during the Civil War in helping to maintain family ties. There were lots of Jews who had family. If you were in the North, you might have had, like Rebecca Gratz, you might have had a sister-in-law in Kentucky. And she made sure to write letters to her brother and sister-in-law throughout the war, even though they were on opposite sides of the conflict. She was going to make sure that political views didn't rip her family apart. So also an interesting lesson for today, where people say, I just can't talk to my uncle, my cousin, because feels this way about politics, and I feel that way, whether it's Israel or the American political scene. So that's always been a problem. And there are individuals, family members, who take it upon themselves to make sure those ties are kept. So back to the anti-Semitism question, one of the most important anti-Semitic incidents occurs during the Civil War when President Grant expels Jews as a class from the District of Tennessee because he's concerned that they're business people who are trying to circumvent and sell and make money off the South and stuff like that. And certainly there were Jews who were probably involved in that, but to expel all the Jews for a few was obviously completely out of bounds. And he eventually, later on, apologized for that and, appointed a Jew to his cabinet. So you see both happening, even in the person of one president of the United States. After that, you have what we would call, I think, in what you were trying to describe, social discrimination. Jews who were not admitted into country clubs, Jews who couldn't admitted to certain hotels, Jews who couldn't buy property in certain areas of the country, certain businesses like the insurance or the banking industries, which were closed to Jews. So Jews then went into alternative businesses. That's why Jews have always played such a prominent role in Hollywood and entertainment. That was a new 20th century industry, so Jews could go right in. There wasn't already an entrenched, Gentile hierarchy there. And then the next time you really see a flare-up of anti-Semitism is during the 30s, in the run-up to the World War II. A lot of it's influenced by what's going on in Europe. And you have individuals like Father Coughlin, who are repeating, first Ford, whom we mentioned, and then others like Father Coughlin, who are repeating a lot of the anti-Semitic rhetoric. And you have the Germans who are trying to infiltrate this country as much as possible. They try to infiltrate in Hollywood. Out on Long Island, there was a Nazi Bund camp in Yaphank, so it hit pretty close to home. So it definitely was there. And then after the war, it kind of went underground. But again, there were still country clubs and areas of Long Island. There were quotas in college in the interwar period. My grandfather, grew up on the Lower East Side. He had to go to he went to medical school at Tulane because he could not get into medical school in New York as a Jew. So yes, all of that is, I think that's a broad overview. The Israel question, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm a historian, not a prophet. But do I agree that some of the statistics are alarming? Yes. Do I agree that for much of the post-war period, American Jewish life had Israel at the core of its identity? So much of our efforts were revolved around support for Israel, raising money for Israel, buying Israeli products, visiting Israel, etc. What I will say, from the long arc of Jewish history, Zionism is a relatively new phenomenon. Most American Jews were not Zionists until after World War II. It's not, what we imagine, that everyone loved Israel and supported the state until very recently. That's not so true. The Reform movement didn't come out pro-Israel till after 1967. And right, that's already that's a very contemporary phenomenon. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's something we don't know enough about to know where it's going to go. Because it's one thing to not be a Zionist before there's a state of Israel. It's another thing to have been a Zionist and to then turn away from the state of Israel. And of course, as with anything else, we can't answer it in a vacuum because it's a yin and yang, right, with what's going on in the state of Israel and the way in which it affects American Jewry. So, I don't know. Okay, so many of the Jews who, let's just say it is a broader phenomenon. Why do you leave your country and immigrate to another? Most of the time you do it because you have to. You have no choice for whatever reason, right? In in the period you're talking about, the 19th century, Central European Jews, they were not emancipated. And they lived in a kind of situation where economically, if you were a firstborn and your father had a business, you were fine. But if you were like the fifth son, you couldn't live there, right? You had to leave because the permit didn't extend to all the children. It just went to the firstborn. So you had to get out of there. And when you got here, you had to make a living. So you're not educated, you have no marketable skills, and you don't know the language. You're going to go where you can make a living. Jews were not farmers in Europe, and they, by and large, did not become farmers here. And they couldn't have owned land if they wanted to because they had no capital. So what's happening in this country? The frontier is being settled. And in the frontier, people need goods. So that is an opportunity that Jews take. And it would be nice to be with other Jews, but that's a secondary goal to food, clothing, shelter, which is the first thing that any human being needs. So that's what happens. Also, a lot of those immigrants are young, single men. So that, they're not looking for robust community at that time. When they marry and settle, then they are. And so they establish those communities themselves.